Okay, so this is lecture number 4 of the Cold War series. I'm Mr. Banks. We're going to talk about the Vietnam War today. We're going to talk about civil rights in the United States, the political developments in Canada in the 1960s, and the Vietnam War. So we'll begin with Prime Minister Diefenbaker. Prime Minister Diefenbaker, John Diefenbaker, the first Prime Minister of German origin. And he was a populist, so that means he gained a lot of popular support as his power base. He appealed to the common kind of middle class or working class people of Canada. And he grew up in Saskatchewan as a lawyer. Now, he got into politics, and in 1956, he defeated Louis Saint Laurent's Liberal Party and won a minority government. And then at another election 2 years later, he won a majority government in 1958. So he's known for the Canadian Bill of Rights, and you can read about that on page 209 of your textbook. And this was a bill that entrenched human rights into the law of Canada as a fundamental principle of Canadian society. So it extended voting rights to First Nations people for the first time. It protected human rights, and it said the Canadian nation is founded on preserving human rights. The Bill of Rights was eventually incorporated into a bigger document, a new constitution for Canada, which was signed in 1982. So Diefenbaker was in power when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And there was controversy between him and President Kennedy over the fact that the American government didn't give Canada enough consultation when they put the NORAD air defense, which involved the Canadian RCAF, the Canadian Air Force, on high alert. And so Diefenbaker felt like the United States was acting in contravention to the spirit of this agreement and kind of taking over the Canadian Army. So that was a little bit scary for Canadians, but it didn't amount to too much in the end. He also refused to accept nuclear weapons onto Canadian soil. So a lot of Canadians were very mixed about whether we should accept American nuclear warheads into Canada. And Diefenbaker ultimately concluded that we shouldn't. And we'll see how Pearson later decides that we will accept nuclear warheads. So the country went into a bit of an economic downturn while Diefenbaker was in power. And so his prime ministership wasn't very long. He would be out of power by 1963. But there's some positives to Diefenbaker's prime ministership. He was one of the few people that dissented against Japanese Canadians being interned during World War II. He also led the fight against South Africa and apartheid, which was discrimination within South Africa against people of color. So South Africa was essentially segregated until right around 1990 when Nelson Mandela was let out of prison. So Diefenbaker felt that South Africa should not be part of the Commonwealth of the British Commonwealth like Canada because they were practicing racist policies. Okay, the last thing I want you to do for this slide is read page 216 and read about Tommy Douglas. So there was a vote a couple years ago for who was the greatest Canadian, and people decided Tommy Douglas was the greatest Canadian in history. So read page 216 and in the comments tell me why was Tommy Douglas considered the greatest Canadian. Okay, Lester Pearson. Now, you might remember Lester Pearson from the Suez Crisis. He was the head of the United Nations, the General Secretary, and the man responsible for the advent of peacekeeping and Canada's role in peacekeeping. So he, as a member of the cabinet during Louis Saint Laurent's regime, he runs for the Liberal leadership in 1963. Same year Kennedy is assassinated, and he is elected prime minister. So we know that he had already won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he uses the opportunity to push Canada a little bit more to the left. And the Liberals take some of the policies of Tommy Douglas and the NDP, and they institute some more examples of what we call the welfare state. So they put in old age pension to make sure that people, when they get past the age of 65, they have some kind of subsistence, some way of living, and if they can't work at that point. So every Canadian after a certain age gets this pension. And universal health care. So that's introduced into Canada during Pearson's government. He also puts in a race-free immigration system. So it's a point system. And the system bases immigration on who has the talents, who has the education. So instead of discriminating against people based on their racial origin or ethnic origin, people that are admitted as immigrants into Canada are admitted for their skills. So this points-based system is basically still in place today. And it allowed all sorts of people in the 1960s to start immigrating. So this is kind of the end of this era where certain ethnic groups are discriminated against for immigration. As a result, lots of people start coming into Canada from all over the world, from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from all sorts of places because of Pearson's policies. He also feels that Canada's flag needs to be changed, and it still had the Union Jack on it, the symbol of Britain. And so Pearson wanted to create a symbol that was unique to Canada. And there was a competition to come up with a design. And many, many people submitted designs for the new flag of Canada. I'm going to show you a video that shows you some of these designs. Some of them are quite silly looking, but ultimately Canada decided on the maple leaf. Now, Pearson, we're going to learn about this later, but he also criticized the US government for their stance on Vietnam. Canada did not agree with the war in Vietnam, and so Pearson allowed people that had crossed the border to avoid the draft or avoid the American form of conscription. They're called draft dodgers. Those people were allowed to come to Canada and stay, and because they didn't want to go to the war. So they sought asylum in Canada. One of those people was my father-in-law, who thought that he was drafted and he thought he was going to get sent to Vietnam, and he snuck over the border in somebody's trunk of their car and lived here ever since. So Pearson was basically someone who believed that the Vietnam War was unethical. So we're going to talk about that in a second. He also signed the Auto Pact in 1965 that allowed free trade with American automobile producers, and it allowed them to open up plants in Canada. They're called branch plants. So a lot of American cars started to be made in Canada as well, and there was a single North American market. So that made automobiles a lot more affordable for the average Canadian. Okay, let's answer a couple questions. Maybe pause the video, see if you can answer them yourself. So, introduced the Bill of Rights, refused to become involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, canceled the Avro Arrow project. Which prime minister is associated with these events? It's not Trudeau, because we haven't talked about him yet. It's not Mulroney. So is it Pearson or Diefenbaker? Well, the answer is D, John Diefenbaker. Number 34, why was the Canada Council for the Arts created? Remember the Massey Commission? This was one of the recommendations to create a council to encourage Canadian arts, because what they wanted to do was counter the influence of foreign culture on Canada. Here are the answers. The civil rights movement in the United States. Well, this has its roots all the way back to slavery. And after slavery ended, after the Civil War, the southern states were terrified that they were going to face an insurrection from all these freed slaves, former slaves. And so they had to figure out what to do with them. And they wanted to put in a system that would keep them as second-class citizens. So the northern states, in order to kind of appease the southern states, they allowed them to put in laws that segregated. So the whole society was segregated in the South. You had separate drinking fountains, separate neighborhoods, separate schools. And to a lesser degree in the North, there was also informal segregation with things like redlining, which were real estate boards would control who lived in what neighborhood. And still to this day, this has had a huge impact on how American cities have been set up, with some areas being ghettoized to this day. So a couple groups come out of the early 20th century. One of them is the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they wanted to make progress for the rights of Black people in America. They did things like publicize lynching photos of those horrible Jim Crow era lynchings you guys saw earlier in the year, and they fought legally for the rights of African Americans. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, there's a bus boycott due to the actions of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks refused to sit at the back of the bus, and as a result was arrested. And all she said was, "My feet were tired. I just wanted to sit where there was an open seat." But she was disobeying the law at the time. And so all the African American people in Montgomery boycotted the bus system. They lost out a lot of money. And eventually they had to desegregate the buses. And this inspired mass protests across the United States. So the Montgomery bus boycott, they chose a spokesperson. And that person was a Baptist minister, a person named Martin Luther King Jr. And he formed something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. And so this group staged sit-ins at lunch counters that segregated against blacks. They started busing people and challenging desegregation. And a group called the Freedom Riders bussed around the South to try to break these laws, to try to use civil disobedience. Now, these people faced a lot of discrimination. They faced attacks from the local population of whites who didn't like this idea, who wanted to keep the system. And some of these civil rights workers, white and black, were murdered. Very famous movie called Mississippi Burning came out in the 80s about murdering civil rights workers. And ultimately, President Kennedy had to come in and bring in the National Guard to desegregate schools and universities. So these protests ultimately were successful. And the reason was that the images of African American protesters, peaceful protesters, being attacked by police dogs, by fire hoses, this went on television sets around the world. And America was supposed to be a leader in the world, and here they are showing that they don't even treat their own citizens properly. So there was a campaign of desegregation. And when President Kennedy was assassinated, the President Johnson was able to push a lot of the legislation that Kennedy wanted through. So President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that outlawed any discrimination based on race, religion, sex, national origin, etc. It ended voting discrimination and at the workplace and in public. So Johnson was able to accomplish a whole lot, and we'll talk about more about what he did in a second. But this was a very tumultuous era in the United States. There were several assassinations along with President Kennedy. So Malcolm X, who we talked about earlier in the year, African-American leader and part of the Nation of Islam, he was gunned down in 1965 with power struggle within his own organization. Then in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated as well. A couple weeks after him, Robert F. Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, who was likely going to win the Democratic nomination and face Richard Nixon, and he may have won that election, become president. He was also tragically assassinated in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel. So I want you to watch a couple videos with this slide. The Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech from the March on Washington, which is considered the height of the Civil War movement, and a news clip about Robert F. Kennedy's assassination. This brings us to LBJ, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson is maybe one of the most, if not the most important president in the 20th century, and accomplished almost the most of any president, but he isn't always thought of as one of the great presidents because he has a bit of a mixed legacy with the Vietnam War. He's really the president that gets America kind of stuck in this quagmire of Vietnam. So Lyndon Johnson is born in 1908 in Texas. He's a Texan Democrat, and he serves as a senator. And while he's serving in Congress, he also served in the war in World War II while an active congressman. And he's seen as a person that understands American politics and American government to a degree that almost nobody else has. So Lyndon Johnson is kind of a tough, crude, kind of tells dirty jokes type of guy. And this doesn't go well with the Kennedys. The Kennedys don't like him, but they know they need him to gain the Southern votes. So they put him on the ticket to be vice president. And when President Kennedy wins in 1960, Johnson is vice president. And as we know, when Kennedy is assassinated, Johnson becomes president. And he uses Kennedy's death as a springboard for some progressive policies. And he's able to defeat his opponent in the 1964 election named Barry Goldwater. So in that 1964 election, Goldwater is seen as an extremist and somebody who may use nuclear bombs against communists. He's extremely anti-communist. And Johnson uses a commercial on television to kind of make people quite reluctant to vote for Goldwater. And this is the infamous Daisy commercial. So I want you to watch this Daisy commercial and tell me, answer the video questions, but also tell me in the comments, like, what is the rhetorical devices being used here in this commercial? More about President Johnson. He passed the Civil Rights Bill for school desegregation, and he created something called the Great Society program. And this was the biggest piece of legislation since Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So the Great Society was going to give voting rights to African Americans. African Americans technically were supposed to be allowed to vote, but there were many laws put in the southern states that kind of like literacy tests and things that prevented African Americans from gaining political power. So that would change. There would be Medicare for the poor and elderly. There would be affordable housing developments. And all these things were supposed to make America a little bit more progressive and put the poor and minorities in more of a position to succeed in the United States. Um, Now, despite these programs, there was still a lot of poverty and desperation in African American communities. So, despite Johnson's goodwill here, there were big riots in the 60s. Race riots in Watts, which is part of Los Angeles, that led to a lot of whole neighborhoods burnt down. Same thing in Detroit in 1967. There were riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And this carries all the way forward to a more modern riot, this anger by African American communities towards police, towards the government, and just a feeling of desperation. And one of the most notable ones is 1991, the LA riots. So this is about 25 years after Johnson, but the LA riots are due to a police video that leaks about a black motorist named Rodney King who was arrested, and his beating was caught on camera. And the police officers that beat up this man, they were, even though it was on video, they were acquitted by a jury. And so people in Los Angeles felt hopeless that they would never get justice, and they decided to take it out in frustration in their own neighborhoods, destroying shops, looting, vandalizing, setting things on fire, beating up people. And so this is issues that still carry on into today. Here's what Johnson said, and I think this still applies today, about race in America. He was pretty knowledgeable about this, being a Southerner, but being a Southerner who was fairly progressive, wanting to change the system. Johnson said, quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." So this has been a policy used in American politics, scapegoating policy, essentially. Like, blame other people for the issues of the country, blame minorities, blame people from Mexico, and you can do all sorts of things as a government. You can steal money, you can commit all sorts of crimes, and nobody will notice because they'll be distracted by their own prejudices. So Johnson understood that on kind of a deep level here. So Johnson's real black mark is the Vietnam War. Let's just go into some history of the Vietnam War. Vietnam, a country that was occupied for a century. They were occupied by the Chinese, then the Japanese, and during the 19th century, Vietnam had been part of a French colony. French Indochina also included Cambodia and Laos. And in the 1950s, they wanted to liberate. They'd fought against the Japanese. Now the French wanted the territory back, and the Vietnamese wanted to have their own independent nation. And so the leader of the communist group in Vietnam was named Ho Chi Minh, who had studied in France and was understood the Western world very well. And he understood that if we pull the French into a guerrilla war, they will eventually not have the stomach to fight this out. So he was right, and the North Vietnamese defeated the French in 1954, and they signed peace treaties that divided Vietnam into North and South along the 17th parallel. Now, the South was under control of President Diem, No Ding Diem was his name, in the 1960s, and he was allied with the Americans. And the Americans were afraid that they didn't want to lose Vietnam, South Vietnam, to the communists. And they were worried about the domino theory. The domino theory said that if we lose one area, other areas will subsequently fall. And so President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy, they started putting advisors in Vietnam to make sure that Vietnam didn't fall to the communists. And so a few hundred American soldiers, advisors, come into Vietnam in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And they're kind of supporting this corrupt South Vietnamese government. Now, this kind of snowballs, and they don't find themselves winning this war. They find that the guerrillas in South Vietnam, communist guerrillas called the Viet Cong, they are gaining more and more territory. And so Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gives more power to send more and more troops into Vietnam. And so America starts instituting the draft. And I mentioned earlier that Pearson, Lester Pearson, refused to support President Johnson here. And there's a evidence that, or a report that President Johnson was so upset with Lester Pearson that he actually grabbed him and shook him when they met at one time. So Canada stayed out of this war, but it was an important issue within Canada and the United States. Now this was kind of an unwinnable war for the US, and they'd never really lost a war before. And the reason was that the Vietnamese, they thought differently of this war. And the North Vietnamese, the communists, and the Viet Cong guerrillas, they thought of it as a war of national independence against imperialist oppressors. And they'd been oppressed for a long time. So America puts in a massive amount of military power. There's an operation called Operation Rolling Thunder, and this drops more bombs on Vietnam than all of the bombs used in World War II. And this leads to a lot of casualties. The Americans think if they just kill enough people, if they keep winning the body count, the statistics, day after day, eventually Vietnam will fold. But it doesn't happen like that. And the Vietnamese kind of get stronger. And in 1968, they launched something called the Tet Offensive. And this totally shakes confidence in the American war. And people back home start questioning this war. And they start questioning, why are we fighting this when we're not winning? And so many of our own boys are coming home in body bags. There's also something called the My Lai Massacre, where American soldiers kill hundreds of Vietnamese villagers. And this gets found out, and photographs get published. And so the war goes really south for America. And people start hating President Johnson. There's people chanting in the streets, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And it's kind of too much for Johnson. And eventually he decides not to run for president in 1968. So I'll show you his speech where he decided that he would not accept another term as president. I want to show you a couple photographs from the Vietnam War. This is a burning monk. So early in the war, this Buddhist monk set himself on fire. And he was called Thic Quang. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And there was a Buddhist majority in Vietnam and a Catholic minority. But the Catholics under President Diem, they had the power. And so Diem had fired on Buddhist protesters and had basically disrespected Buddhist temples and religious protests. So this monk, as a protest, made sure that Western cameras were watching, and he set himself on fire. And this image went across the world, and it showed President Kennedy when he saw it that President Diem, his days were numbered as president of South Vietnam. And President Diem was assassinated a couple weeks later and removed from power in a military coup. So this image had a huge amount of power and a big effect on the war. This is another image from the Vietnam War that was shocking. There's also a video of this same instance. This happened in 1968 during the Tet Offensive in Saigon. And a photographer named Eddie Adams, he caught the exact moment of a Viet Cong prisoner's death. And the guy being executed here, he was kind of coldly and calculatedly just shot in the head. No trial, no arrest. And it showed Americans like what kind of brutality they were supporting. Even though this Viet Cong man was a terrorist, he had killed children apparently. The whole story wasn't known. All was known was that this South Vietnamese officer just shot this guy in the head right there on live TV. The third image here is an image of what we might call collateral damage or accidental casualties. And these children were in a village that was accidentally bombed with napalm. And napalm is a chemical that it burns the foliage off trees, but it also burns skin. And so these children they got part of their skin covered in napalm, and so this one girl in the center, her clothes have burnt off. And that girl eventually became a Canadian citizen. She eventually went to Cuba, and then she defected in Newfoundland. But this image also showed that the Americans were maybe doing more harm than good in Vietnam, and a very powerful image that helped change public opinion. This is the Vietnam Memorial, kind of a very powerful, moving memorial in Washington, D.C., and it has the names of every American that died in Vietnam. And the war lasted from about 1962 or 3 to about 1972 or 3, so about 10, 11-year period. And a lot of tragedy in that war. There's me in front of the Vietnam Memorial about 10 years ago in D.C. Now the home front. So, along with the war itself, there's a war going on at home. And the war is causing political turmoil all over America and Canada as well. College campuses there are massive protests against the Vietnam War. And one of these protests at Kent State, Ohio, turns out really ugly. And the National Guard opens fire on American students. And 4 of them are killed. The famous Neil Young song called 4 Dead in Ohio. So this image is of one of these victims of the shootings at Kent State. And we talked about some of these protesters and some of the people worried about being drafted, conscientious objectors, people who don't believe in the war, coming up to Canada. And in the United States, those people being called draft dodgers. Okay. We already talked about the Canada Council for Arts, so let's just talk about question 35 and 36. Which of the following describes the changes to Canada's immigration policy in the 1960s? It refused refugees. That doesn't sound right, does it? Canada refusing all refugees? No, that sounds like a Donald Trump idea, so we can cross that out. B, it gave priority to American immigrants. Why would we give priority to American immigrants? I don't remember talking about that, so that's not right. It increased access for visible minorities. That definitely seems right, because remember I said how it was not based on race anymore? So that is the correct answer, C. Number 36, which conflict did Canada refuse to send its military forces? The Gulf War, we haven't talked about that yet, but Canada did send soldiers there. Yugoslavia, same thing. Korean War, no, Canada sent troops to Korea. So the answer has to be D, the Vietnam War. So out of the 1960s, there came a huge counterculture, a culture against the mainstream. And these are the baby boomers. The baby boomers were growing up and becoming teenagers or young adults, and they were being surrounded by this whole civil rights movement, by decolonization, by the Vietnam War, by women's rights. The birth control pill was introduced, and so women had more reproductive rights. And college campuses were the center of these protests and these new liberal ideas. So at these college campuses, there were sit-ins where the college was shut down because of student protesters. There were burning of draft cards. There were boycotts of companies that were part of the military-industrial complex. And there was also the hippie movement. So hippies were kind of less political and mostly middle-class white kids. And one of the slogans of the hippie movement and of the kind of drug LSD culture that Timothy Leary talked about, that was the slogan was "Tune in, turn on, and drop out." The idea was society wasn't working for all these young people, and they should find their own happiness and find their own consciousness. And a lot of them use recreational drugs. They listened to new forms of music like Jimi Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, to name a few. And the height of all this countercultural movement was a concert in 1968 called Woodstock in New York. This was the height of the peace and love era, along with what was called the Summer of Love in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district. So I want to show you a video about Woodstock, just kind of how crazy it was and how weird this time was. And we'll end the lecture there. Next time we'll talk about President Nixon and Pierre Trudeau and the FLQ crisis. Thank you for listening.